De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 41, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. And today we're talking about Alan Dershowitz, a guy who I find to be creepy as hell, who is a shill for Israel, a shill for Zionism, for imperialism, for the Democratic and Republican Party, support for the quote-unquote state of Israel. And so today we're going to take a look at Dershowitz's arguments in defense of the settler-colonial state of Israel, the apartheid state. We're going to talk about how Zionists attempt to portray themselves as victims, as underdogs, as David against Goliath, which is a whole topic in and of itself. And we're also going to talk about the importance of supporting Palestinian national liberation against Zionism, imperialism, and also how the axis of resistance, Iran, the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah, the Ansar Allah movement, and so many other movements in the Middle East have been in defense of the Palestinian people, Palestinian liberation, which is something that is not often talked about, the core defense of Iran with Palestine. And joining me today is the most banned person on Facebook, my brother, Mohsin Abbas, independent TV journalist, broadcaster, and a current affairs analyst, somebody who does amazing work. Make sure to check out his segments on Press TV. Does amazing coverage of not just the Middle East, but the world overall. How's it going, Mohsin?
Very well. I think that's the best introduction I've ever had. Again, you've outmatched, you've outdone yourself again. To be the most banned, yes, I like that.
Every time I see your poster status, it's like I'm free from Facebook jail, and then you're thrown back in, and then you're free again. And what I like about your post, Mohsin, is that you don't hold back. You say a lot of the uncomfortable truths that people think and necessarily don't say and don't put out there. And because of that, I think you're somebody who's censored. You're somebody who, because of your independence, you're not controlled by any mainstream corporate media or NGOs. You're just a regular guy, a humble working class guy in the UK, who just is telling the truth and saying it from the heart. And because of that, they target you. And especially when it comes to Israel, you're somebody who does not hold back. So I love having you on to discuss this. So the other day, I was watching the speech by Alan Dershowitz, who I'll tell you a little bit about who he is now. But basically, he's a big-time Zionist in the U.S. He is a lawyer known for his work in the U.S. constitutional law and criminal law. He taught at Harvard Law School from 1964 through 2013. He's a media contributor, political commentator, legal analyst. Dershowitz has been known for taking on high-profile and unpopular causes and clients. In 2009, he had won 13 of the 15 murder and attempted murder cases he handled as a criminal appellate lawyer. So somebody who's defending the slimiest, dirtiest people in the U.S., murderers, criminals, pedophiles, some really disgusting figures. Dershowitz was the member of the defense team for Harvey Weinstein in 2018. Harvey Weinstein was the Hollywood official who was violating and raping women and trying to use sexual blackmail for his position of power. Dershowitz also was on the impeachment trial of Donald Trump, aka Zion Don, as I like to call him, in 2020. And Dershowitz was a member of the legal defense team for none other than Jeffrey Epstein and helped to negotiate a 2006 non-prosecution agreement on Epstein's behalf. And he was later accused of rape by one of Epstein's underage victims in a sworn affidavit. And there's an interesting Netflix documentary where Dershowitz is featured. It's called Jeffrey Epstein Filthy Rich, which resulted in a lawsuit and a counter lawsuit. And Dershowitz is somebody who, again, right, he comes from a very shady background, very shady people that he's defending. And yet he has the audacity to defend the attacks, the genocidal attacks on the Palestinian people, on Muslims. He's very Islamophobic, very racist against Arabs. In 2006, Dershowitz argued for the prosecution of one of my favorite presidents, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, for quote-unquote incitement to genocide based on Ahmadinejad's, quote, threat of wiping Israel off the map. In his 2015 book, Dershowitz, The Case Against the Iran Deal, he argues that the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has urged the Iranian military to have 2 nuclear bombs ready to go off in January 2005, or you're not Muslims. And Dershowitz also, interestingly enough, maybe we can talk about this later on, in 2012, he filed an amicus brief in support of delisting the People's Mujahideen of Iran, MEK, from the State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations, which is really fascinating because it shows the collaboration between groups that claim to be left or groups that are anti-Iran with Israel, the collaboration there. Before we get into talking about some of his positions on quote-unquote Israel, why don't you tell us, Mohsin, about some? Are you familiar with him? Have you heard of him in the UK, or and just who he kind of represents overall?
His name is familiar. I've come across his work. I can't say I've followed in detail, but your resume would, I think, be quite a thing for, I think, anybody from the halls of Satan. He could probably do a pretty good job auditioning and getting the lead role in his in whatever plays he's producing. It really is quite mind-boggling the kind of direction this gentleman has taken, and it's interesting. I'd rather he did ally himself with Israel because he's in the right place, really, with that. If he was arguing for the good guys, I'd be extraordinarily worried to be associated with him at all. But quite clearly, he's somebody who's obviously a high profile, and he's these sort of chaps, usually in my experience, are clandestinely paid for by the network of Israeli and Zionist, if you like, shills that we have spread across virtually every aspect of institutional life in the West and beyond. This is something which people still haven't really grasped. That first of all, when you talk about Israel, it's not just the territory we know as Israel now. When we talk about Zionism or Zionists, we aren't talking about a group that is restricted to the confines of the borders of what's known as Israel, the illegal entity known as Israel. They span every echelon of the networks of politicians, of media, of the economists, of the banking industries, And again, I'm not, of course, we start treading on this territory. Let me make it clear. Zionism is a political ideology, and it's a very nasty political ideology, and it does have a large number of Jewish extremists that are at its helm. There are Christian extremists, we could describe them as Christian Zionists. There are Muslim Zionists, even official state leaders of the Islamic world are clandestinely, really, they're Zionists. They operate for them, they work for them, they act for them. But we have a term called taqiyya, which is very regularly, I think, employed by Zionists as their networks have grown and built. Many of them have gone undercover and will even deny their Zionism. They'll deny their Jewishness, even perhaps, for the sake of the cause. And I'll go on to evidence this with outfits like the Unit 8200, or that are run by the Israeli secret services or their security arm, if you like. There are many other examples. IPAC itself is one of the more visible and obviously Jewish lobbying outfits. So there are two types of organization: the clandestine organizations that work for Israel's interests, and there are the overt ones that operate. There are those that will declare themselves as non-Jewish, linked and not linked with the Judaic faith, and there are those that will openly cite it. So it's a very complex network of support which has been spread out by not just Israel, because Israel itself is beholden to funding and money that comes from the mega multi-zillionaire wealthy structural elite. The Rothschilds I can cite as being at the heart of the formation of Israel, just as one example. And when you say the Rothschilds, of course, that means that we're talking about every banking institution in the world, from JP Morgan through to any of the others. They will all somewhere along the line, Goldman Sachs, they'll all somewhere along the line, if you start doing your homework and your research, be connected and supporting Israel in one shape or form, overtly or covertly. That's the nature of the beast that we're dealing. It is actually so expansive that you could argue that Israel is really the structural elitist, the money mafias, the money power. It is their primary boots on the ground expression, not only in terms of the military status it has in the West Asia, but also in terms of its cyber presence, his cyber security, infiltration of global communication, global networks, global military units. We can go into that in more detail as we go along, but this is where I'm coming from, that the likes of Mr. Dershowitz are really he's just a very, very humble minor player within a very, very vastly expansive network of such folk, all operating at the same wavelength, same frequency, but from different angles.
Most definitely. Well said. And shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. IL, Safe Fishing, Solidarity with Palestine. Of course, long live Palestine. Howard Saldana, a true Jewish person with Palestinian solidarity and sovereignty is Norman. Fit Goldstein's respect to Norman. Exactly. Well said. And I think immediately the Zionists, that one of the things that they do is that they immediately accuse you of anti-Semitism. This has been recorded. Even IDF officials have come out and said that that's something we do, is that we accuse anybody who's critiquing Israel and Zionism as an ideology of being anti-Semitic, which is a common tactic that is used. Marxist Hibaro said, Jesus, what a disgusting guy, referring to Dershowitz. And he's really, really, really disgusting. I want to play the clip. Before we get into talking about his support for Israel, I want to give you a sense of who this guy is, what he's involved with. This is a clip from April 2019 when the Epstein stuff started coming out. Dershowitz is somebody who's very connected to Epstein, and we can go into a whole nother thing about Israel and blackmail and how they use blackmail to control world leaders. So this is a clip from April 2019, Dershowitz denying any involvement in the quote-unquote sex slave trade.
Britain's Prince Andrew speaking out for the first time today to deny accusations that he had sex with an underage girl, allegedly being kept as a sex slave. That young woman also claims she was forced to have sex with high-profile defense attorney and Miami Beach resident Alan Dershowitz, who also denies those accusations. Local 10 News investigator Bob Norman spoke with Dershowitz today.
She's an admitted prostitute. She's a serial liar.
Attorney Alan Dershowitz today lashed out at his accuser, Virginia Roberts, who swore in a new affidavit that he had sex with her while she was an underage, quote, sex slave of wealthy Palm Beach financier Jeffrey Epstein.
She's lied.
But she wasn't lying about being sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein as a minor, correct?
That is between her and Jeffrey Epstein.
Roberts, one of dozens of underage girls allegedly recruited by convicted sex offender Epstein, also released new photos, including this one she says was taken by Epstein when she was about 15. In the new affidavit, she claims Dershowitz had sex with her 6 times at Epstein's residences, as well as on his jet and private island, and swore to seeming new details regarding alleged sex with Prince Andrew at Epstein's order when she was 17. The two are photographed here in London.
I can tell you she is still a prostitute. She is selling false stories now for money about me.
Do you have any concern calling her a prostitute when she was victimized at such a young age by this wealthy man?
She was not victimized. She made her own decisions in life.
But at the age of 15, some would say that's a little young and that she was taken advantage of.
I'm talking about the age of 19. Look, that's between her and the federal government and the people that she claims victimized her.
Dershowitz is a longtime friend of Epstein's who represented him in the criminal underage sex case.
Could you please? I never saw a young underage woman.
Yet Epstein's former butler swore under oath that Dershowitz was at Epstein's residences at the same time underage girls were there.
Were there young women in another part of the house giving massages when I wasn't around? I have no idea of that.
Dershowitz did say he once received a massage at Epstein's mansion, but from an adult woman.
I kept my underwear on during the massage. I don't like massages particularly.
So I'm just gonna come out and say this guy's fucking lying, and he's creepy, man. And I wanted to play that just to give you some context as to who he is, what he represents. He's here in the U.S., at least on the other side of the pond, as we say in the UK. He's one of the main faces of Zionism, of the Israel lobby. And before I pass it over to you, Brother Mohsin, I want to play a clip from a 2014 debate between Alan and Mark Lamont Hill. Again, CNN. This is from CNN. CNN is liberal, they're whack. And Mark Lamont Hill, although he had some good points on Palestine, he's also a little bit more on the liberal side, which whatever is fine. But I think he held down some good defense of Palestine. So I want to play some of this, Alan Dershowitz defending Israel fiercely on CNN.
80% of the people in Palestine who have died are civilians. So if they're going to great care, they're not doing a very good job. I also don't begin from the place of, because Alan always begins from placing Israel in a defensive position and saying, what would you do if these people were firing upon you? The problem with that logic is that begins with Palestinian resistance as opposed to Israeli occupation. If you begin from the place of Israeli occupation and you talk about Palestinian resistance to that, then suddenly the question should be, what would you do if you're Israel and you're an apartheid state and you're an occupying force? That to me is the more fundamental question here. And again, I'm not, and let me hold on, Alan, and hold on, Alan, and hold on, Alan, please. And once again, I'm not defending the killing of innocent children. I'm not defending breaking of ceasefires. I'm not suggesting that Hamas is above critique. I'm not pro-Hamas. I'm anti-occupation, and that's a very different conversation. And that's what the United Nations is attempting to do.
Apartheid states were engaging in bigotry. Look, I fought against apartheid. I was part of the legal team for Nelson Mandela. I know what apartheid is. How dare you call Israel an apartheid state? Arabs and Jews worked together, lived together, served in the Knesset together. The Gaza was emptied of all occupation in 2005 and 2007.
I hope I get a chance to respond.
Israel left behind all of the greenhouses. Hamas turned them into terrorist rockets. Shame on you for calling Israel an apartheid state. Well, you have become part of the problem, not part of the solution, Mark.
Well, your moral censure aside, I'd like to respond to that. First of all, if you look right now, there's first, second, and third class citizenship for Israelis versus Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, Arab Israelis and Palestinians.
Please,
Alan, let Mark respond.
I'll just wait for him. Are you done? Thank you, sir. If you're talking about occupation ending in 2005, right now Gaza is still controlled by land, by air, by sea. Israel still has a blockade. Israel still controls the population registry. Israel still controls the electromagnetic sphere. Israel still controls movement. Israel still controls the entering and leaving for Palestinians. It still controls the construction of supplies. It still controls the water, the food that comes in. It still controls the economy. Palestinians have not had one day of self-determination. If you don't call that second-class citizenship and an apartheid state, shame on you.
Well, you talked about Israel being an apartheid state, number one. Number two, Israel...
Address those points I made, though. Address those points I made, Alan. Address those points instead...
Gaza, you're interrupting me. Gaza has had self-determination. They voted, and the foolish people in Gaza voted for Hamas, and look what it's gotten them. It's gotten them horrible conditions. It's gotten them turning the possibility of having a wonderful area of Gaza turned into a terrorist base. And when you use your civilians, by the way, another myth is that Gaza is very densely populated. Look at a map sometime, and you'll see there are areas of open space that Hamas could use to fire rockets. They choose to go to the dense areas of the Gaza Strip rather than to the empty areas, precisely because they want to incur civilian casualties. I call this the dead baby strategy. They know that when they put their rockets in front of civilian areas, Israel will have to respond, children will die, and they're ready to show those children on television. The media falls for it, you fall for it, and that only encourages Hamas to do it again and again and again.
All right, Mark.
So that's a little bit about the debate. This is from 2014. By the way, before you say CNN is based and amazing for allowing this conversation to happen, Mark Lamont Hill was fired for defending Palestine. He was fired from CNN. So, Mohsin, your thoughts and reaction before I pass it on to you. I just wanted to say that the one thing when we were talking about the kind of satanic elements of the argument that Dershowitz says, the illusion of choice, these young girls chose to go to Epstein Island. The Palestinian people chose to elect him. This is kind of the logic that he's using. Your reaction?
Well, Dershowitz is manifesting the classic narcissist trends and traits. That what you do straight away is, as an abuser, whether it's as a state, Israel as an abuser of Palestinians or its neighbors in the region, or whether you're an individual lackey who serves Israel as narratives and works for them, like Mr. Dershowitz no doubt is, you immediately project back onto the very victims that you've destroyed, whose lives you've destroyed. It's just a classic technique and tactic, but it actually, first of all, for me, straight away puts Dershowitz in the category of an extreme psychopathic, narcissistic individual, somebody who's in denial and will deny because he's on a payroll and that's his job. So he's going to say that. So that's the first thing to get out the way about just a psychological kind of analysis of who Mr. Dershowitz actually is as an individual. The fact that he could completely also disassociate himself from an establishment such as the now supposedly deceased Mr. Epstein, without any kind of further, analysis, also just shows you just how calculated and cool these people are about what they do, and just how easy it is for them to just fob off to their victims the crimes that they commit. Okay, so the fact is that, Israel itself, he talked about Israel, and I'd like to come on to what his worldview was. First of all, Israel itself is an illegal entity. It's not a state which was in any way the right of the British Empire at that time, the Balfour Declaration, the Rothschilds, all those who were involved. First of all, they had no right in legal terms, in moral terms, or any humanitarian terms to hand over a land that did not belong to them, wasn't theirs to give, and at the same time arm, support, and encourage the physical extermination of those people, the violation and the robbery of their lands and their territory, as well as their displacement throughout the world. This was a calculated act of daylight robbery and a sort of genocide as well, I would say, yes. And it was particularly cruel and criminal, given that it was done on the back of a war, Second World War, in which also the Jewish fraternity claim, of course, holocausts and all sorts of oppression, which no doubt existed, but it also happened for the gypsies at that time, or the travelers, as we might call them, or whatever, or the Romani people, whatever term you want to use these days. It happened to Russians on a far larger scale than anybody. And in fact, the Germans themselves were victims of bombings of Dresden and all sorts. So, you know, there's another thing that the likes of Dershowitz and such folk do, is they pull on the heartstrings of people by focusing on only one genocide, as if in the 20th century that was the only one. We've forgotten about Cambodia, we've forgotten about imperialist sort of genocides, you know, across the world. Other than that, we've forgotten about Hiroshima, about Nagasaki. We forget about, you know, the never-ending wars of the US imperialists, Zionist, you know, inspired, no doubt, because the Americans, since the 60s, the late 60s, have definitely completely fallen into the hands of Zionist lobbies and the interests of Israel and the global Zionist networks. So we've got this kind of really blinkered view that Mr. Dershowitz wants to give, because that's his job, and it's his job to do exactly what he did to the individual in the interview as well, which is not to let them speak, and to also label them as with anti-Semitism, and to go into denial about the apartheid situation of the Palestinians, which is absolutely there on record. You can see that they're not allowed to do the same things, go to the same places, work in the same kind of way as their Israeli counterparts, and they're under constant surveillance. So I would say that, you know, everything that Mr. Dershowitz says in his narratives is just so vomit-worthy and so untruthful that I don't even know where to start. I just could carry on with the whole program on that. But I'd like to zoom out and say his masters, the likes of Israel and the Zionist fraternity, right from their outset, Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, was very committed to not only the annihilation of the Palestinians, but also of the neighbors. And you can see this borne out in his early strategies and policies, in which he wanted to wipe out Transjordan. He was clearly wanting to destroy Syria and to wipe that scenario out. He wanted to bomb Egypt into submission. Literally, their entire strategy at that stage was destroy all the neighbors. That was one aspect, and it was that strategy has never stopped from that day dot. It manifested itself publicly in what's known as the Yinon Plan, which was a Zionist plan for the Middle East, for the domination of the Middle East by Israel, a strategy for Israel's, written by Oden Yinon, who's a former advisor to Ariel Sharon. So that's one manifestation and evidence of what this attitude of Israel's has been towards its neighborhood and how it operates. That was one thing. The periphery doctrine is the other aspect I'd like to draw people's attention to. So the Yinon Plan and the periphery doctrine are two things which have been absolutely at the heart of Israel's belligerence and offensive attitude, and violently offensive attitude, and a violently offensive attitude which basically it justifies the occupation of the Golan Heights. You know, it occupies airstrikes in Syria today on a regular basis. It justifies the bombings of Iraq and so-called nuclear plants that they had. It will justify the cyber attacks on Iran, which go on a regular basis today. It justifies, all of these so-called, preemptive strikes that they do. And do it without any kind of, kickback from the international community whatsoever. They're allowed to operate with impunity, so much so that even their medical care and attention and support of ISIS and Daesh in the region for their own purposes has never been questioned. So much so that their lack of commitment to the non-proliferation treaty, being the only nation in the Middle East, in West Asia, to have nuclear weapons fully charged and ready. That's not just one nuclear warhead. They have over 400, which I think Mordechai Vanunu was arrested and imprisoned for many years and is still hounded by Israeli security forces. So you can see the litany of violations of international law and disregard for international law that begins with its birth, manifests with Ben-Gurion and his initial policies, manifests with the Yinon Plan and the Periphery Doctrine, which I can talk about a little later as well. So you can see that everything that Israel does is about destabilizing, creating conflict, creating sectarian warfare, making Arabs fight Arabs, and also advancing US imperialist interests in the region. And the United States is the primary culprit who has bought into this and financed and bankrolled the Israelis to do their dirty work to the tune of $4 billion per annum at the moment that we know of. Let's not forget the private finance and the donations which go under the carpet and are backhander deals which are given to Israel in order to maintain its imperialist designs in the region. And the result is the destruction of Iraq. I would bring it right back to Israel, the invasions of Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war, the millions that died as a result. Again, the machinations of the American imperialist intent in the region. The civil war in Syria, again, comes back to the same culprits. The control of despots and dictators in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, in Egypt, all of these nations, Kuwait, even Jordan, they are all backed, supported, and propped up by Israeli American weapons, money, and security interests. Without them, as Donald Trump said, they would collapse. He said this of Saudi Arabia. They would collapse within a week. And if Saudi Arabia, with all its zillions, would collapse in a week, what do you think Israel would endure, given it doesn't have that level of finance or infrastructural connection to that region? Because they are largely an illegal people who don't belong there. They've been imported in from the places like Russia and whatnot. They don't have roots there. So that's my take. Mr. Dershowitz stands up for this nation, this so-called illegal nation, which does all of this. Now, the moral credentials that he has and the moral credentials that Israel have, I'll leave it to the audience to make their own assessments on that.
I think it's also important to discuss Israel's international role in fomenting violence and bloodshed, aside from the Middle East as well. Something we've spoken about before is the untold story of Zionist bloodshed in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's something that is not really talked about. And it's not just Latin America and the Caribbean, it's also Africa and Asia as well. But in Latin America, after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the governments of Guatemala that was overthrown in a US-backed coup after the United Fruit Company, the new coup government that was backed by the US and also Israel, they began supporting the right-wing evangelical Christian church in Guatemala that oversaw the genocide of indigenous Mayans. One of the most notable right-wing Zionist presidents in Guatemala, Efraín Ríos Montt, in the 1980s. He was appointed in 1980. He actually came to power in a coup, my mistake. He is somebody who is extremely pro-Israel, extremely pro-US. He was put into power through these evangelical proxies in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he compared the indigenous Guatemalan Mayan people to the Palestinians. He viewed them as satanic. He called them demonic. He said that they were inferior to Christians, to evangelicals, to lighter-skinned Guatemalans. And at this time, Menachem Begin from Israel, the prime minister, was selling weapons to Efraín Ríos Montt, knowing full well that he was carrying out a genocide of Guatemalan indigenous peoples, many of whom were in the socialist anti-imperialist movement fighting the right-wing government. And this is a part of the interesting history that's not really talked about, because Israel bankrolled a genocide of indigenous peoples in Guatemala, in El Salvador as well. During this time, we had the government of Roberto Davison, who was also a Zionist Christian evangelical backed by Israel, murdered thousands of indigenous Salvadorans who were part of the FMLN movement, the guerrilla movement that was fighting against the Anglo-Zionist backed government of El Salvador at the time. In Nicaragua, the Contras, the right-wing Contras, I actually have a video coming out soon, the counter-revolutionaries from Nicaragua, who were armed and financed by also Israel, not just Reagan and the US, but Israel as well. And they played a role in organizing the quote-unquote Iran-Contra scandal. That's a whole nother interesting aspect, as well as in South America during the 80s, during the Operation Condor, a lot of the right-wing military dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, Pinochet, in Colombia, in Peru, all of these governments that had actual neo-Nazis that also collaborated with the state of Israel, that also got arms, weapons, and training from Israel, this is something that is almost never talked about as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, Zionism is not just about Palestine and the Middle East. It's international. It's an international system that infects all areas of society.
Yes, and so much so that you'll see that here in Britain, for instance, there's another example. People need examples, don't they? But it's on public record that the Tory party is through its kind of links with the Friends of Israel within its circles, very heavily dictated to, but also the targeting of politicians in Britain, for instance, has been carried out by the Israeli intelligence services, and it's on record that they tried to, threaten, that they tried to, undermine individuals within politics. We only have to look at Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism campaign. I mean, you couldn't find a more gentle, a more moral politician in the world than Jeremy Corbyn. And when he's become the leader of the Labour Party, you see what happened, that the anti-Semitic card is released in order to completely destroy his credibility, and it became such a behemoth that even the Labour Party has totally crumbled. And these are the psychological operations. These are the subtle political controls that are able to be used by the Zionists as and when they require, because the hub of their power is in economics. It's in the money world. Wall Street, the central banking system, the Bank of International Settlements, the institutions that operate within the City of London, for instance, the Corporation of London Corporation over here. If you went to the Far East, then again, those markets, Hong Kong, at the heart of it, one cannot ignore that the Zionist network has a huge hold on that economics. Now, that economics and those banks actually hold to ransom states. They, for instance, in Britain, I know that on record and on paper, and it's probably much more in reality, the Corporation of London, the City of London, generates 20 to 30% of the British gross domestic product. Its economy is totally beholden to the banking industries, or the banksters, who are in turn, in my humble opinion, there's plenty of evidence to see that these banksters also have a huge leaning towards Israel and a love of Zionism as well, just from their behavior and where they invest. If you go and look at what their investments they do. So we cannot, first of all, discount what's going on there. Now, the point is, Parliament in Westminster will not squeak when it comes to the corporations. They will not take on the corporations, because they know that all the corporations now have to do is move their base from the City of London to Frankfurt or wherever else they like. And that would mean there's a huge gaping hole in the British economic system, the way it's set up. The entire service industry here, which is what Britain actually runs on, would collapse within a matter of days. And then if I was to really trace the likes of Marks and Spencer's and trace the corporations, the front companies that are supplying food, for instance. The simple thing, just in the last month or so, we saw the supply chains were rattled, and suddenly there were shortages going on. So you can see how powerful a control by say, for instance, Zionist international networks could be in terms of bringing down a nation. In Britain and America, there's the threat of doing it. And there are, in my humble opinion, many organizations that are on their payrolls, whether it's your Antifas or others, that are operating on this basis to undermine even the US at the moment. But you can see in places like Lebanon today, where Israeli and American and Zionist banking industry, banking forces, and others are operating in total, unison with all those people within Lebanon who want to basically have it collapsed. Why? Because they're up against Hezbollah and they need to uproot the resistance axis. Israel can't do it militarily, so the next best thing is to create psyops, to create color revolutions, to get the banking system there to collapse. And that's exactly what they've done. They've basically made the Lebanese rial worthless, and they cut off the energy supplies until Iran starts then sending oil, etc. So you see that one of the major weapons of Zionism is economic terrorism. And economic terrorism means that you can terrorize politicians and leaders into doing whatever you want. Because if you can't keep your economy rolling, no government will survive. Now, this is a very subtle form of power and what I call soft power, which is employed, but it goes below the radar of the average citizen Joe, because he doesn't understand economics and he has no understanding of what goes on and how it operates. He just feels the effects of that economy hitting him, and then he's obviously manipulated. If he can't pay for his bread and butter, pay for his wife's clothes, go on a holiday, everybody moans at him. You have a society which is in potential conflict there straight away. So I just wanted to hint at this kind of this network, this powerful network, which has really $28 trillion of debt hanging over America, around 3 or 4 trillion debt of Britain. You know, some of the wealthiest nations in the world are in debt. Who are they in debt to? What impact does that debt have on the political policies of those nations? These are questions that, first of all, people need to ask. I mean, I've done my homework, and my research tells me that they become a blackmailing tool for Zionists, primarily, who are part of that structural elite. It's not exclusively Zionist, I would say, but it is certainly heavily populated by those folk who we would describe as Zionists.
Most definitely. And shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. By the way, David Silver said, true story, I was coming out of Stereo Jack's, a record store in Cambridge, when Dershowitz walked by. It took me a second to orient myself, but when I was 100, it was him. I yelled, "You're an asshole." That's hilarious. Shout out to Dust James. Shout out to Oscar Morales, who said, I'm from Nicaragua, and I lived during the war years. That's exactly right, Mohsin. And I think even on a spiritual level, there's something really dark about the way Israel and Zionism uses money magic to leverage pressure and war against people, creating something out of nothing. One thing that Vladimir Lenin talks about in his 1917 pamphlet, Imperialism, High Stage of Capitalism, is that there's a difference between industrial capitalism and finance capitalism. And in the early 1900s, we saw the rise of finance capitalism, of banking institutions, bankers, money mafia, lending organizations, making money out of thin air, making something out of nothing. And even if we look at the Christian Bible, the Quran, this is something that is prohibited and banned. Usury is banned. And Israel has, in the 21st century, become the hub of this usury, financial capital, economic warfare, that it controls economies around the world. It can divide and conquer people. And I think that's a key point you mentioned earlier, is the divide and conquer strategy that dates back even to the Rothschild family and their peninsular wars, how they divided the French and the British, how they funded both sides to be able to win both sides. And we've seen this even happen within the left, where a lot of the Zionist, quote unquote, leftists who infiltrated the left during the early 20th century, they began supporting Trotskyite movements that were pro-war, pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, pro-imperialism. and they began dividing the left. They said it was anti-Semitic to call them bankers, to even point out international bankers was anti-Semitic. And then they also created a rift between the Islamic world, the anti-imperialist Islamic world, and the left. And this is all recorded. If we look at people like Irving Kristol, if we look at people like Karl Gershman, who are all connected to Israeli intelligence, these are documented evidence of how the Zionists have been able to infiltrate even different movements. Like you said, there's Zionist Muslims, there's Zionist, they in every sense, they'll say, okay, what are the two contending factions? Let's create this division and divide. So I want to, before we continue, I'm loving this conversation, by the way. I want to play another clip. This is from Dershowitz. This is from The Case for Israel, a speech at Harvard Kennedy School, where he talks about why he defends Israel.
I think of myself as a moderate advocate of the two-state solution, but one who strongly believes in Israel's right to defend its civilians against terrorist attacks. And the question I want to pose tonight is, why is there such an enormous disparity between the reality on the ground, between what actually is happening, between Israel's position and Israel's posture, and the perception or the accusations directed against Israel? Just imagine a space alien coming from a distant planet and landing at the United Nations or landing at a French university. And they would come away with an interesting perception. They would say, this is a wonderful planet. It has countries like Syria, which serve on the Security Council of the United Nations, Libya, which serves on the Human Rights Commission, previously as its chairman. But there's this one terrible country that has been condemned more often than any other country in the history of the United Nations, Israel, and that is described at American universities and European universities as, quote, a criminal state, as comparable to Nazism. And by the way, I'm not making these things up. Norman Finkelstein, quote, I can't imagine why Israeli apologists would be offended by a comparison with the Gestapo. Noam Chomsky, who says that Israel has always rejected the two-state solution, whereas the Palestinians have always accepted it. Well, perhaps on Planet Chomsky. But in the real world that we're going to talk about today, we'll see that the history is somewhat different. It's called colonialist, apartheid, genocidal. And the question is why? The question is, why is this perception so different from the reality? Let's talk about just 3 or 4 basic issues. The two-state solution. If you look at the history, it becomes so clear that the charges are simply historically false. From the very beginning, the goal of Israel and the group that ultimately became Israel was to establish a Jewish democracy in those areas of a land that had been inhabited by Jews since the beginning of recorded time, and that many other Jews came back to beginning in 1880 and through the beginning of the 20th century. And they wanted to establish a Jewish democratic state only over those areas of land in which they could be a majority. I mean, it was always a desire to create a Jewish democracy, and you can't have a Jewish democracy if you seek to control land over which you do not have a majority of the population.
Your reaction, Brother Mohsin, to Dershowitz talking about Israel and all this other nonsense?
Well, first of all, let's talk about about the two-state solution. It's interesting that he quoted Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, and of course, that's where he's limiting the debate to. He's, on the one hand, talking about his vision, which is basically an imperialist Israel that does what it's likes in reality. But he, as the only other alternative, he raises the idea of the two-state solution. Why a two-state solution? Who said the two-state solution was something that was just in any way, shape, or form? Well, okay, if Noam and Mr. Finkelstein say it, and of course there's our movements that are there in the mainstream which say it, then we have to analyze who are those people who pushed this two-state solution. And the first thing is that the likes of Yasser Arafat, even the leader of the PLO, etc., eventually succumbed to this notion. But the truth of the matter was the Oslo Accords, etc., were a full they were a sham. They were just buying time, and they were just a method of getting the Palestinians. The PFLP would have never accepted the idea of a two-state solution. They wanted Palestine back as a whole the way it was. What was the point otherwise of the struggle? But of course, by shifting Palestinians through the international pressure, through the sort of winding down process, they managed to limit this discussion now to this idea that Israel is actually de facto unquestionable. It's there, and there has to be a two-state solution. So for a two-state solution, we've got to accept that Israel actually has the right to exist, first of all, and then the Palestinians get some kind of scraps. That having been done, they've then gone off to the next stage, which is what they really want to do, which is get rid of the Palestinians altogether from there. So the settlements and the violation of all the so-called United Nations clauses on there have become the norm now. And so much so that Palestine now only has something like 1/20 of its original land that it can say that it belongs to it. And Gaza, being the open prison, is another sort of slight on human civilization to say that that is a legitimate way to treat the people that actually are the true owners of the entire territory we know as Palestine, which they call Israel. Now, one-state solution, that's the only solution in Palestine. All of this other business is basically obfuscation and red herrings, and is playing games. Norman Finkelstein and other academics, I respect them, but I'd respectfully disagree and say that they've actually fallen for the trap of being controlled opposition. By plugging the two-state solution, what they've done is they've allowed and helped Israel, and I would argue that a lot of the Jewish left, the well-meaning Jewish left, do that, but there are also not so well-meaning Jewish lefties who are probably psychological operations, or what I'd call controlled opposition, manufactured by the hardline Zionists in order to take over the Palestinian struggle and to become their voice. I'm sorry that that's the way it is. The truth is that the real Palestinian voice, the real solution now lies with the likes of Hamas and the resistance axis. Those are the folk who actually are the ones who speak for Palestinians, not even the PLA, because they're clearly just a Zionist puppet proxy force that's designed to keep Palestinians quiet in the West Bank. And they've done a pretty good job of it for quite a while. But of course, recent events have seen all of those plans unfurling and unfolding with the kickback that they're getting. So people are wise they become wise to the Israeli tricks, and Palestinians are reclaiming their true position, their true state, which is one-state solution, a right for all heritage Palestinians to return and to have a vote in a democracy which is not a Jewish democracy, but one which is Palestinian. The right for Jews who lived in Palestine, or heritage Jews who lived there, to also be equal members of that society, but for a big question mark to be raised about those imported illegal immigrants, those people who've come to Israel in order to be occupiers and who are religious fanatics, extremists, or atheists, Zionist fanatics and extremists. They're the people that don't belong in that land. They have no heritage connection. They come as outsiders and as illegal immigrants. They would have to be questioned when the return of the one-state Palestinian democracy arrives. And this is what the resistance axis is fighting for. Israel knows this, and Israel is doing everything it can to avoid this reality. The only way it's going to be achieved is by a military defeat of Israel, or a complete rejection and the bravery of the Palestinian people in rising up to make it impossible for Israel to manage that land anymore. Israelis aren't having it. What they're doing, the Israeli establishment, the Zionist establishment, is expanding. And their expansion is not just in control of Israel now. And I want to bring it back to this, because this is really important. Unit 8200, for me, it is the Israeli cyber spy agency. It's like the NSA of America, or the GCHQ of Britain. Doesn't get any real scrutiny. But I've been tracking their activities as far as I'm able to. And on those activities, the most dangerous thing that I've seen Israel now beginning to do is that it's actually infiltrating the corporate world in a very, very clear and obvious manner. I mean, I can quote some companies, I'll come up with their names shortly, but they're able to do data mining, operate state security systems. They're now being hired to do the most detailed and most security conscious and most fragile and vulnerable aspects of other states' business. And that could even mean their codes to their nuclear weapons, or they're protecting those. It could mean having access to state secrets. It could mean access to public phone calls. It can mean access to the internet records of everybody that exists out there. And who is doing this? It's actually an Israeli spy agency which plucks out the most brilliant individuals that they can find and puts them through a course, a set of courses, and trains them up, then uses them for the Israeli military, number one, but more dangerously, I think, allows them to become part of the mainstream of the corporate world. And there are plenty of examples that one can go into. The alumni for the Unit 8200 exists, and it's very public there. There are 15,000 of them in the network. You've got there are people, for instance, the CEO of MER Group he's the actual the chair of that particular alumni group, and he essentially operates in plain sight. He's there advising Verint, another company which has its root in Israel, which does video audio monitoring, for instance. They're there within other agencies, and in Beersheba, you'll have to see what Israel is doing to believe it. They've literally got an entire installation, a city almost building up in the Negev desert, where they are channeling all of the cybersecurity forces. And in fact, the whole global cyber world has to pass through the Israeli scrutiny and through their networks. That's where they're controlling the bulk of this. It's not in Silicon Valley. What they do with Silicon Valley is send their trained agents, that's what they are, to become CEOs, and then to take charge of global cyber industries. So whether it's Mr. Zuckerberg, or whether it's any of the others, Mr. Bezos or Mr. Elon Musk, the trail will all ultimately lead back to these same elitist, wealthy money mafias, which are creating what is described as the new reset of the world. And that reset of the world is all based on the virtual reality, on the cyberspace, and in the world of the internet. And that's where Israel is investing most heavily, and they want to take charge of that realm where we are all locked in now.
Most definitely. Now they even have the metaverse, which you mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg. Now they're creating a whole alternate universe where they're going to control everything we say and do. And it seems like an episode. The funny thing, Mohsin, is like, this is something that when I talk to you, we're on the same page. And for us, it's like we understand each other. But when I talk to my friends about that stuff, like Israel and Zionism controlling the metaverse, they think I'm crazy. They think I'm like some lunatic conspiracy theorist, but it's real. It's happening. And I want to share this article. This interesting, shout out to my friend Ben Norton, by the way. He has a great project, the Gray Zone. You mentioned control opposition, and even within the left, this happens with how, by framing it as the two-state solution being the most extreme, they're creating sort of a boundary as to where the acceptable dialogue is. And Jacobin Magazine, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. Let me just read this tweet. The pro-imperialist social, this is from April 24th, 2020, by the way. The pro-imperialist, quote, socialist at Jacobin Mag got over $230,000 in 3 years from a right-wing pro-Israel group. In 2019 alone, the Jacobin Foundation got $141,000 from the Zionist org, and it's called the Jewish Communal Fund. And here's the tax receipt. Here are the receipts in case anybody wants to check. In 2019, the right-wing Zionist group Jewish Communal Fund gave $77,500 to the Israel on Campus Coalition, a virulent anti-Palestinian group. They also gave it to J Street and to Jacobin Mag. And here's the other groups that they were funding, Israel-connected groups. And also, Jacobin and the SA had already been co-hosting events featuring regime change activists funded by the U.S. government's NED-SCA cutout, which was against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, and Cuba. So even within the left, the Zionists have been able to infiltrate, to divide and conquer, to create a limited spectrum, like you said, controlled opposition. Because by framing it a certain way, you're able to keep people from supporting Iran or supporting the axis of resistance that says, nope, we're not playing any games. We want full sovereignty and power for the Palestinian people. And I kind of compare it to, it's kind of like if I were to go to your house right now, Mohsin, I'm like, and I go to your apartment, I set up shop there. I'm like, I'm not moving anywhere. I'm bringing my belongings. And then your landlord comes or the police come. And then instead of the conversation being around me leaving your apartment, I just walked into your apartment, to your home, and I'm just setting up shop. Now the conversation shifts over to, well, okay, maybe let's give you the kitchen and me the bathroom and me the living. It's like, wait a second, I'm not even supposed to be there. You know, so by completely like shifting that dialogue, by having this controlled opposition, you're moving the goalposts, you're moving the focus away from what the real goal is, which is Palestinian sovereignty and liberation.
Absolutely right. And I think that, you know, we must obviously stay focused on Palestine and West Asia, where the primary impact of Israel's machinations take place. But the reality is that the very first victims of Zionist, if you like, violence or terrorism were the Jews themselves. If one looks at the groups like Natura Kartai, for instance, the Jewish Orthodox fraternity, who are very vocal in both New York and London, and I've had the pleasure of talking to Rabbi Cohen and various others within their networks, and such lovely, humble people, and they actually relate to you the hidden history of Zionism and its violence, first of all, to its own Jewish fraternity. People don't understand this. Before Palestine, before the public emergence of Zionism, there was a campaign that was undertaken to wipe out the true Judaic, if you like, very peaceful, very, you know, of course, very spiritual ideologies, and to politicize it into a kind of a political, religious political ideology of a very, very nasty kind. And those Natura Karta individuals will go back and tell you stories of Poland and of the Eastern Europe and the Russian fraternity, who were all first pummeled into this kind of Zionistic version of Judaism. And you see the ISIS people, for instance, in Islam, will today say, we're Muslims. They'll say, we are the ones who are Islamic. You know, you'll get Daesh, you'll get Al-Qaeda, all of these guys, political entities which are really hatched and prepared by Western and Zionist and Israeli intelligence services, all lay claim to Islam and have hijacked the headlines of the world and labeled Islam as being this kind of terroristic, you know, producing faith. Well, they did it to their own Jewish fraternity first, from what I can analyze, and the eyewitnesses in the history that's related by these Orthodox Jews that I meet. And so clearly, first of all, our hearts go out to the hijacking of Judaism by Zionists. And then, of course, Christian Zionism that you talk about in America. Let's not forget that. Of course, Christian Zionism was an absolute must for them. Once the money had been transferred, or the investment by Zionists and high-level money lenders from Europe, having broken down colonial imperialism of Europe through the First and Second World War, they moved much of their investment and their finance and their wares from Europe into the coffers of America. On the back of that investment, you found, after the First and Second World War, this massive rise of the American, star, and the imperialism of America begins in earnest. And of course, that is a history, again, that they won't talk about, but they are doing arguably the same thing now. I would say that they're uncomfortable perhaps arguably even in America now. And what we're seeing is in this new global reality, the money power may be shifting to Israel, maybe shifting further east. We don't know. But the reality is that you cannot underestimate the actual engineering and the political power that these people have. Let's take the obvious characters they throw in the front line, the likes of Mr. George Soros, who gets involved in various political shenanigans around the world. These are the visible ones. Robert Maxwell is one that is exposed, we all know about, and he was conveniently lost in the oceans somewhere. You know, his daughter is involved with Mr. Epstein, and Mr. Epstein is involved. You see, even within their own circles, it seems that their own are not they're not immune to being made examples of or being used in order to terrorize everybody else. You see, for every Julian Assange, there are hundreds of thousands of other journalists who will get the message that you don't talk about certain things or you don't do certain things. For every Epstein, you'll find hundreds of thousands of politicians involved in pedophilia or whatever else they get up to, taking the hint, taking the warning that this is what happens if you don't comply with what we're saying. This, I think, shadow mafia of a unit which has a high Zionist, if you like, as I say, proportion, spreads fear and terror in the hearts of people who are running the levers of power out there. And I think that Israel is the greatest lever of power that those wealthy elites have. America is its willing servant in many ways and partner in crime. And of course, NATO and the European nations hitherto have prospered from those money mafia wealth allocations, Anglo-Zionism, as I call it, have all complied and have all operated as they've been told. And I think this is what faces the world as a major problem. And Mossad and the agencies that are within these kind of Anglo-Zionist networks have extraordinary levels of infiltration and power. They have extraordinary abilities to be able to know everything that we're doing and to be able to engineer things as a result. They give it a good go. Of course, it's not an exact science. Islamic Revolution of Iran is one example where I think what they miscalculated caused them huge headaches subsequently. And that seems to be one of their major problems at the moment in the world, is the technological rise of Iran, the independence of Iran, the self-sustainability economically of Iran, its desire to have an influence within its region, its desire to eject Israel. It's not just based on the material power or the political power. It's also based on an objection that Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei, at the core of those movements, has about Zionism and this money elite's morals and their spiritual direction. It is pretty clear that what is happening within all these circles is not a prophetic virtue-orientated society, as, say, the Christian West was at once, or it certainly tried to be, and it failed as well in many ways, just as the Muslim world failed in many ways to live up to those values. But at least those values were there. We knew that prophetic virtues and values were clear-cut. What was good, what was bad, was much more easily definable. Since, I think, this insertion by the money mafia and their Zionist troops on the ground and their other institutions, what we've seen is one of the fundamental shifts in that ability of humanity to understand what is right and wrong. I'll give you an example. Practically, the sexual revolution of the 60s, primarily initiated in the US and weaponized by, I believe, the Anglo-Zionist money mafia imperialists, has resulted in everything from homosexuality being promoted actively, sexualization of public spaces, for instance, promoted actively. We've seen, militant feminism promoted actively. We can see also the values of materialism, the greed and the individualism and the narcissism within society rapidly rising. We're seeing the medical terrorism which is emerging, and a totalitarian medical terrorism. For me, all roads lead right back to the same source. You know, it's the money power and the money mafias and the Zionists that are definitely involved, whether they're Christian Zionists, Jewish Zionists, Muslim Zionists, atheist Zionists, I don't care. They are definitely at the heart of most of these shenanigans. And the reason they do these things is because if you have more conflict, if you have people fighting between Rosenbaum and Rittenberg, for instance, you can get people to fight over whether pedos should be beaten to death by individuals, whether we should take law into our own hands, or you could make them fight about Sunni versus Shia on the other side of the world. You can make them fight about nationalities, about Iran and Iraq. You can make them go to civil wars. This is the business that these people are involved in. They do not want a peaceful, moral, virtuous, harmonious world. What they want is a divided world, which is then convenient for them, because then we are too busy all fighting each other about over our sex, over our gender, over our our rights as our political identities. They've got us all fighting on in identity wars while they clean up and make as much money as they can and carry on looting and plundering the world, and probably having quite a good laugh about it as well.
Wow, well said. And it's so connected as well to the 60s, the counterculture, the sexual revolution, and the drug culture, because in the United States and the left, in the 60s and the 70s, the drug culture was also promoted hard within the left, and the sexual revolution. And it's interesting because a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies are tied to Israel. For example, the Sackler family, which is the family behind Oxycontin, which is the biggest drug behind the opioid crisis in the United States. All across the US, you have people who are addicted to opioids en masse. And it times perfectly with the US occupation of Afghanistan. And the Sackler family is one that is very pro-Israel, invested in the Israeli pharmaceutical industry. They support US wars and invasion abroad because, interestingly enough, they make millions and millions of billions of money from the opioid crisis and epidemic, getting people hooked on their drugs, getting people distracted, divided. And this is profitable for a lot of the companies that are connected to Zionism. And it's interesting because this is something that the Sackler family, that is very high up in the Zionist chain of ranks, the empire of opioids today. This is something that the original Zionist families, two in particular, that's interesting. If you ever get a chance to look up, one of them is the Kadoorie family, a Hong Kong-based family of Zionists in China. They call them the Rothschilds of the East. And during the 1800s, the Kadoorie family made millions and millions and millions of dollars getting the Chinese people hooked on opioids. And also the Sassoon family, also called the Rothschilds of the East, that made tons of money from the opioid addiction crisis in China as well. So by getting people hooked on drugs, by dominating the merchant areas, by dividing and conquering, keeping people in a low vibrational state, by subverting even music. Even, it's interesting, hip hop in the United States originated from the Black nationalist liberation movement, was very Pan-Africanist, was very also connected to resistance movements around the world, very conscious. And there's all these documents that have surfaced that in the 70s and 80s, the Israeli intelligence and the FBI began infiltrating hip hop, began subverting it, began promoting drug use, capitalism, money. And this is all forms support. And even around this time, the IDF was advising a lot of Hollywood film producers of portraying Muslims, the image of the Muslim man with the bomb strapped to him. That was something, that image, that stereotype was promoted by the IDF to immediately associate any Muslim with terrorism, with bombs. And meanwhile, Israel's the biggest terrorist, and they get away squeaky clean. So just like you said, man, I think this is something that infiltrates so many areas. And I think a lot of times we're not really aware of it.
Well, people's attention is drawn by mainstream media to what they want them to see. So I tend to look at the mainstream media now as really just a symptom-based outlet. All they do is they show you the symptoms of a problem. They'll poo-poo, and then they'll try and dictate to you what it means. They'll offer no solutions, and they will never tell you the root causes, and they will never give you context. always. Any of the main state-run organizations that are Anglo-Zionist, imperialist, supporting, whether they're corporate or state, you'll see this is one factor. Never will they give you the broader context. They won't go into the deep roots of such things as the Middle East conflicts, etc., or Israel's origin. It'll always be symptoms. It'll all be just always seeing a Palestinian throwing a stone and maybe an Israeli soldier. That's all you're meant to look at, and then you can't make any real moral judgment or an overview. You have no real overview unless you go and start digging up, finding your own research. And of course, what they've done is, again, with the system as it's created by the Anglo-Zionist culture, or the forces that dictate these policies to these governments. Well, first of all, a fundamental one is that children of the ordinary masses are not given critical thinking skills. So if you don't have reasoning skills and you don't have critical thinking ability of depth, and you also don't have a critical inquiry thirst, what you become is really just somebody who absorbs information. So you're just really a unit of either production and consumption at the end. You're not a thinking individual that can really has got the skills, the critical tools, the skills, the inclination, the thirst, the desire to do the kind of analysis that, say, you and I might be doing on our own, simple level. So what you have is a myriad of individuals from Pakistan to Indonesia to wherever, all either illiterate. I mean, the worst there is that they don't get any education. But in the West, what you get is an education system which deliberately dumbs people down and doesn't want them to be able to make those connections. So because they're not able to do the reasoning, they can't join the dots. And because they're on a treadmill of being able to just about survive with paying mortgages and paying for houses and buying basics and just having that lifestyle that allows them to be basic humans, they are sold out to that. They don't have time. So first of all, you don't have the education. When you're of a working age, you don't have the time on your hands to do the research. So you go through this entire life completely robotized and regimented for the material, if you like, imperative. And you're either a consumption unit or a production unit. So my problem is really that unless people are willing to educate themselves, unless they're willing to train themselves in reasoning skills, unless they're willing to do their homework about what Zionism is, who the Anglo-Zionists are, who the money mafia is, what bankrolls this entire movement, and then they're willing to also make that moral commitment that they will not buy into that system, because everything, even all those high street stores you see, and now the likes of Amazon and Bezos, if you want to go and trace their roots, I can give you two names. Vanguard is one company, and I'm going to forget the other one offhand at the moment. There was one more on my mind, but these two companies essentially own literally everything from Coca-Cola through to Pepsi, through to all of these other big corporates that you think are all independent out there. All these massive techie companies, Facebook, whatnot. They could all their trails lead back to a couple of these very large transnational corporations, which again, I would argue, and my argument would be, is that they are the ones that call the shots. In amongst that, Zionism as a military and as a feet on the ground outfit, it is the poor kids in America who get siphoned up by the US military, combined with Israel on the front line over there. Why they kept Israel in Saudi was obvious, because the big resource, and they relied on carbon energies. That was what the game was about then. But they still seem intent on staying there for some reason. I guess because it's the central part of the world where all the trade routes will pass through, where all of the connection, even of the Belt Road initiatives that the Chinese are doing, ultimately Turkey, Israel, Syria, Iran, this is the central hub. Without these nations, you can't really do the connections as quickly and as simply. So my warning would be even to the Chinese establishment, be careful, because, and perhaps they've taken heed because Alibaba and others have been brought to heel, that you should not follow the model of Anglo-Zionist imperialism, and you should not really rely on these kind of investors to drive the future that certainly China seems to be wanting. Because the minute you let these guys in, to the likes of Iran or others, what they will do is they will buy up the people at the top, give them the incentives of a hyper-capitalist greed motive, and then what you'll find is that you will have handed over your entire commons, the land, the water, the electricity, the airwaves, everything will belong to them. They will impose usury on you, so you will be indebted to them, and you will never be able to come out of the yoke of that death grip of the mortgage and such things. You'll have everything mortgaged, you see. And then, of course, finally, they have this hold on structure, the power structures. So all the guys who are at Harvard or Yale or end up at the Unit 8200 establishments or in Oxbridge, there's an elite from within them that will be earmarked by intelligence services, by the Zionist sort of fraternity, that will then be groomed for power, groomed for the highest positions. This is a sort of glass ceiling that will hit the ordinary folk. But that beyond that glass ceiling, the only people who will be able to reach the prime minister roles, the roles of decision making, who will be privy to all the secret information, etc. There's a very, very small cadre which is analyzed by these intelligence services in order for them to operate as good little boys for what I call the Anglo-Zionist imperialist mechanism.
Most definitely. And Oscar Morales in Nicaragua, he said, the companies that you're mentioning are the ones that have all of us as slaves. Nothing has changed. Very well said, Oscar. And also Big Teal said, Mohsin is spot on when it comes to the limits of mainstream media. I remember watching the news as a kid in the 90s, seeing Palestinian children throwing rocks, and couldn't figure out why this was happening. Indeed, they control the media, they control the metaverse, and they control, that's why I tell people, I'm like, get offline, get out of debt, get offline, spend time, prioritize your family, your friends, your community, because and don't value money, don't value the creation of something out of nothing, because that's something that is artificial, it's synthetic, it's not real. And in my opinion, I think it's the way that that the capitalism, imperialism, Zionism is able to control everyone around the world into worshiping this religion of profit, of surplus value. So it was really dope speaking with you, Brother Mohsin. We start off with Alan Dershowitz, who is the face of Zionism in the U.S., and have been able to talk about Zionism overall, which I think is very important for people to understand how it works systemically overall. Mohsin is an independent TV journalist, broadcaster, current affairs analyst, the most banned person on Facebook. I'm going to give him that title, and rightfully so, because the content that he puts out there, he does not hold back. Please follow him on Facebook if you are on Facebook. Anything you want to say, brother, before we head out?
I would just say that the hope is this, that first of all, I'm a believer in the sublime, and the plan of the sublime is always going to trump these people. They're up against not just us, they're up against a force which is far more powerful than them. And the hope that people should have is not only that the divine will intervene in order to stop their worst plans, because the worst plans right now could mean that we're handing over our internal identity to these individuals. They have now, with all this technology, they have the ability to be able to release nanotechnology of a kind of a mind-boggling kind. They can take us into virtual worlds where they can mine us for information on an incredible level. They have the ability to be able to really now not only control us externally, as they did with the surveillance capitalism they had, but they now want to go internally. So first of all, I'd advise, do not give them that access. To being able to chip you, to be able to get into you just for the sake of their access points, which is what they're going to try next with all this metaverse business. The second thing is that you can disassociate from them. Don't go and buy from their big mega stores. Go to the local suppliers. Support your own family businesses. Support the local guys, so that you're building alternative businesses. Maybe even start creating transactions locally where you can, where you're bartering, etc., and whatever. And yes, 100%, reduce your desires in this world, because what they rely on is your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, or your desires, whether that be porn or whether that be a Lamborghini, or whether that's sort of. So you've got the power is within us. They have no power unless we give them the power. We trust their banks, we trust their money, we trust their goods that they supply us, and then we feed off those, and they feed off the fact that we become beholden to them. I'd say take back your own sovereignty first of all, fight for the sovereignty of others, and fight against all oppression. And anybody that is oppressed out there, stand up for them, whether it's with word or deed. That's part of the resistance philosophy. It's not just about fighting on the front lines against Zionist or Israeli forces or American imperialism. It's about fighting on every front, and that starts in your own home. Protect your children and protect your communities, and build communities, build family. Don't let them undermine motherhood, which they've done with the sexual revolution. The main target of the sexual revolution narratives was mothers and family. Bring back motherhood to where its status should be, and make your family strong, make your community strong, and don't be totally reliant on their systems.
Beautifully said, Mohsin. And I think of the word, recently I was reading about what the actual word jihad means, and the struggle, the internal struggle that you have to not succumb to your desires, because that is how the Zionists, the imperialists control us, through alcohol, through poison, through porn, through sex addiction. And then when we look at Alan Dershowitz, Epstein, and the big time Zionists and their sexual blackmail, this is how they control you, through shame, because when they have you in a position of shame, they can do anything they want with you. And so that's why, like you said, it's important to live upright lives, to stay within our communities, defend our people, and to not succumb to them. Because the second we want these desires, right, the shaitan, that's when the shaitan begins to appear, where we want that alcohol, we want that lust, and we have to keep the higher state of righteousness. Even the name, like for example, the name Sadiq, I think means the righteous one, or maintaining righteousness. And I think that's something that's beautiful. And I think for me, somebody who's on the left, I think that it's something that I think people on the left have to really study more, open their minds to understanding that. And to really embrace it. But I could talk with you for hours, brother. I look forward to having you on soon, man. Again, Mohsin is an independent TV journalist, broadcaster, current affairs analyst. Please support his work on Press TV and on Facebook. Peace out, brother. And we're going to go out to a beautiful song called My Blood is Palestinian by Muhammad Asaf. Peace out, everybody. Have a great weekend, and take care, brother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you for inviting me.
على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا فديهم أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني على أرض تلاقيني أنا لأهلي أنا فديهم والله أنا دمي فلسطيني 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 أنا دمي فلسطيني وقفنا لك يا ديرتنا بعزتنا وعودنا Palestine.